Hi everyone, thanks for joining us today. We're taking a quick moment to highlight Edible Uprising Farm in Troy, a really special farm that is also featured on Harvest Connection, which is our platform connecting the community with local growers. Edible Uprising is an urban farm doing incredible work on a small footprint. They focus on growing nutrient-dense vegetables using regenerative practices like no-till soil care, compost-based fertility, and planting with pollinators in mind. Everything they do is rooted in ecology, community, and thoughtful farming. One of the coolest parts of their work is their CSA program, which uses a sliding scale to make fresh local food more accessible. They also host workshops and community events, helping people feel connected to where their food comes from. Because of farms like Edible Uprising, Harvest Connection can showcase the diversity of agriculture across our region, from rural operations to vibrant urban farms right in our cities. Their listing on Harvest Connection helps people discover their CSA, learn their story, and stay connected to what's in season. Now remember, urban farms play an important role by improving food access, strengthening neighborhoods, and showing how agriculture can thrive in creative spaces. Edible Uprising does all of that beautifully. If you'd like to explore more farms across the capital region, please head over to Harvest Connection and see the amazing work happening all around us.
Hello everyone! Today we're going to learn how to make sauerkraut, one of the most popular and easiest fermented vegetables to make at home. While the principles we'll cover apply to other fermented vegetables like pickles, we'll be focusing on sauerkraut, and at the end, we'll make a batch together. So what exactly is fermentation? When we make sauerkraut, we're submerging cabbage in a salty brine for several weeks. During this time, something amazing happens. The proper amount of salt prevents spoilage bacteria from growing while allowing beneficial lactobacillus bacteria to thrive. These lactobacillus bacteria produce lactic acid during fermentation, and this lactic acid is what preserves the cabbage and transforms it into sauerkraut. This process is sometimes called lactofermentation. The fermentation changes the color, flavor, and texture of the cabbage, creating that distinctive tangy, complex flavor we love in sauerkraut. The USDA has done extensive research on fermenting cabbage for sauerkraut, so we have solid science-based guidelines to follow. This is important because proper fermentation isn't just about flavor, it's about food safety too. First, salt. This is absolutely essential for making sauerkraut. The salt concentration must be exactly what the USDA tested recipe calls for. For sauerkraut, we use 3 tablespoons of salt per 5 pounds of cabbage. Never reduce the amount of salt in fermented vegetable recipes. The salt serves 2 purposes. It bonds with free water molecules, which decreases the chance of microbial growth and spoilage, and it creates the right environment for lactobacillus bacteria to flourish. The salt also draws juice out of the cabbage, creating the brine that will preserve your sauerkraut. For salt, use pickling or canning salt if possible. This is pure granulated salt with no anti-caking agents and no iodine. If you must use regular table salt, just know that the anti-caking agents will make your brine cloudy. Iodized salt will darken your sauerkraut. Never use sea salt, rock salt, or ice cream salt. And salt substitutes like potassium chloride, they'll give you crisp cabbage, but it will taste terrible with a bitter flavor. Now sugar. Here's the beautiful thing about sauerkraut. You don't add any sugar. The cabbage itself contains natural sugars. These sugars are food for the lactobacillus bacteria, and the lactic acid they produce is a byproduct of their metabolism. This is the acid that actually preserves your sauerkraut and gives it that wonderful tangy flavor. The container you use for fermentation is very important. You need to use something that won't react with the salt and acid being produced. For making sauerkraut, your best choices are a 5-gallon stone crock, which is the ideal size for fermenting about 25 pounds of fresh cabbage. Food-grade plastic and glass containers are excellent substitutes for stone crocks. You can also use wooden barrels, stainless steel containers, unchipped enamel-lined pans, or large glass bowls. Large food-grade plastic containers are available at winemaking supply stores. Even gallon jars that originally held mayonnaise or mustard work great. For smaller batches, like the 1-quart recipe we'll demonstrate today, a wide mouth quart mason jar works perfectly. Just be aware that fermenting in smaller jars may result in more spoilage losses because it can be harder to keep the cabbage submerged. What should you absolutely avoid? Don't use copper, brass, galvanized, or iron utensils. Copper can turn your sauerkraut an odd shade of green. Iron will turn it black. And the action of acid or salt on galvanized utensils, which are treated with cadmium, can produce toxic substances. You'll also need weights to keep your cabbage submerged in the brine. Use a clean, heavy plate covered with a plastic jar filled with water or pickling brine. Never use stones or bricks because they introduce impurities. A heavy food-grade plastic bag filled with brine works wonderfully. It acts as both a cover and a weight. For fermenting in quart jars, you can use a smaller jar that fits inside the opening or specialized fermentation weights. Temperature control is crucial for successful sauerkraut fermentation. Let me break down what happens at different temperatures. The ideal temperature range is 70 to 75 degrees Fahrenheit. At this temperature, your sauerkraut will be fully fermented in about 3 to 4 weeks. This is your sweet spot for the best results. If your room is cooler, between 60 and 65 degrees, fermentation will take 5 to 6 weeks or even longer. At temperatures lower than 60 degrees, your kraut may not ferment at all, which can lead to spoilage. If it's too warm, above 75 degrees, fermentation happens too rapidly. Your sauerkraut will end up soft and may even spoil. The final finished product really depends on your personal taste. As fermentation progresses, the sauerkraut becomes more sour. Some people like it milder after just 2 to 3 weeks, while others prefer a stronger, more tangy flavor after the full 4 weeks. When your sauerkraut reaches a flavor you like, move it to the refrigerator. The cold temperature will essentially stop the fermentation process, and it will keep for 4 to 6 months refrigerated, or you can process it in a water bath canner for long-term storage. So remember, store at 70 to 75 degrees, be patient for 3 to 4 weeks. Check for bubbling to stop, and trust your taste buds to tell you when it's ready. Here's something critical you need to remember. Fermenting cabbage must be kept submerged in the brine at all times. Why is this so important? Yeasts and molds that form on the surface during fermentation will spoil your sauerkraut. Some yeasts and molds can grow on top, causing off flavors and undesirable texture changes. You need to check your fermentation container daily, or at least 2 to 3 times a week. Look for surface scum, which consists of yeasts that destroy lactic acid, and molds that produce enzymes that will soften your kraut. If you see any scum, skim it off and discard it immediately. A tight-fitting cover, like a brine-filled or water-filled plastic bag, can help eliminate air from the surface, which reduces the growth of yeasts and molds. This is actually one of the best methods for sauerkraut because the bag conforms to the shape of the container and creates a good seal. If you use this method and don't disturb the bag, you may not need to check as frequently. If you're using jars or a plate as a weight, you'll need to check the kraut 2 to 3 times each week and remove scum if it forms. Here's another important point. Do not stir or mix your fermenting sauerkraut. This adds air to the brine and introduces yeasts and molds from the surface throughout the entire batch. Just remove surface growth and leave everything else alone. Once your sauerkraut has fermented to your liking, you have several storage options. Option 1. You can keep it in the original crock for a few months while flavors continue to develop. Store the crock in a cool place, preferably 60 degrees or below. Keep the cabbage submerged and continue checking for surface scum, yeast, or mold, removing them immediately if they appear. Option 2, transfer it to the refrigerator, either in the original crock or repacked into glass jars. If your brine is cloudy, you can filter it through a paper coffee filter to make it clearer. Fully fermented kraut will keep tightly covered in the refrigerator for several months. Now, here's an important decision point. If you want to preserve your sauerkraut for long-term shelf storage, the USDA recommends processing it in a boiling water canner. You can use either the hot pack method, where you bring the kraut and liquid slowly to a boil, then pack it into jars, or the raw pack method, where You pack the cold kraut firmly into jars and cover with juices. Processing times vary by altitude and jar size. For example, at 0 to 1,000 feet altitude, hot pack pints need 10 minutes and quarts need 15 minutes. Raw pack needs longer, 20 minutes for pints and 25 minutes for quarts. However, and this is crucial, heat processing will destroy the beneficial probiotic bacteria that are so good for digestive health. So you have a choice: process it for long-term shelf stability but lose the probiotics, or keep it refrigerated for 4 to 6 months and retain those healthy bacteria. Many people who ferment specifically for health benefits choose refrigerator storage to preserve the probiotics. Let's finish up the theory portion by talking about what can go wrong with sauerkraut and how to handle it. Sometimes a jar of sauerkraut will seal properly if you've processed it, but then weeks later you notice it has lost its seal. The liquid becomes cloudy and you see bubbling. This is usually the result of unintentional fermentation continuing after processing. Good news, this sauerkraut is safe to eat. Just observe the jar. When the bubbling stops and the cloudiness settles, the fermentation is complete. You can safely reprocess sauerkraut if the seal was lost due to unintended fermentation. Here's what to do. Allow the fermentation to complete. Strain the brine through a wet paper coffee filter. Bring it to a boil and simmer for 10 minutes. Pack the sauerkraut into clean hot jars. Cover with hot brine, leaving half-inch headspace. Apply hot lids and rings, and process for the recommended time based on your altitude and pack method. However, do not reprocess if your sauerkraut was spoiled by surface yeast or mold. Just discard it properly. What about pink sauerkraut? Sometimes you might notice your sauerkraut turning pink or reddish. This can happen when certain yeast strains grow, during fermentation, or when the salt concentration isn't quite right. While it's usually safe to eat, if the color is accompanied by off odors or sliminess, discard it. As with all preserved foods, properly discard any product you suspect of spoilage. This includes sauerkraut with bad odor, a mushy texture, or slimy appearance. A covering of mold on sauerkraut may allow botulism bacteria to grow in the anaerobic environment underneath. Any product with mold must be properly discarded. The key takeaways? Follow USDA tested recipes exactly. Never reduce the salt. Maintain proper temperature between 70 and 75 degrees. Keep cabbage submerged. Check 2 to 3 times weekly for surface growth. And when in doubt, throw it out. Now we're ready for the fun part. Let's make sauerkraut together. Now that we've covered all the theory, let's talk about the recipe we're going to demonstrate today. We're making sauerkraut in a jar, which is perfect for beginners and for those who want to make smaller batches. This recipe makes 1 quart, and it's incredibly simple. You'll need just 2 pounds of cabbage, which is about 8 to 10 cups when shredded or chopped, and 1 tablespoon plus half a teaspoon of canning or pickling salt. That's it. Just 2 ingredients. Here's the process we'll follow. First, we'll wash everything in hot soapy water. Then we'll shred the cabbage to the thickness of 1 to 2 quarters. We'll combine the cabbage and salt in a large bowl and mix thoroughly, then let it stand for 5 minutes. This waiting time is important because the salt needs time to begin drawing juice out of the cabbage. Next, we'll use our clean hands to press down and squeeze the cabbage to draw out even more juice. We'll repeat this until the cabbage starts to become soft and we can see juice in the bottom of the bowl. Then we'll pack the cabbage and juice into our wide-mouth quart jar, pressing down to release any air pockets, working with a few handfuls at a time. If the juice doesn't completely cover the cabbage, we'll add some boiled and cooled brine, which is 1.5 tablespoons of salt per quart of water. Then we'll push the cabbage under the brine using a smaller jar that fits inside the opening, or a food-grade plastic bag filled with brine. We'll cover it with a lid, just tightly enough to keep out insects and mold, but not so tight that the gas produced during fermentation can't escape. Or we can use a heavy cloth. We'll place the jar on a tray to catch any juice that bubbles out. And here's important: do not pour the juice that bubbles out back into the jar. We'll let it ferment for about 3 weeks or until we no longer see bubbling. If we use a plastic bag with brine as a weight, we won't disturb the bag. If we use jars as a weight, we'll check it 2 to 3 times a week and remove any scum that forms. Once it's done, it will keep several months in the refrigerator, or we can process it in a water bath canner for shelf-stable storage. One important note about fermenting in mason jars: it's acceptable, but you may have more spoilage losses than with a larger crock. This is because it can be difficult to keep the cabbage submerged under the brine. Fermenting in jars is most useful if you plan to make just a few jars and refrigerate them rather than processing. If you're fermenting several heads of cabbage, it's best to use a larger container. Now let's get started with our demonstration.